Before I begin my watercolor, I'm going to take my watercolor set and I'm going to do a test swatch. So I'm going to take a scrap piece of paper, and this could be a scrap piece of watercolor paper, or this could be a piece of sketchbook paper. Since I'm just doing a test swatch of each of the colors that are in my watercolor set, it doesn't have to be watercolor paper because I'm not working on the paper a lot. So any scrap of paper you have, I would divide it up, label each of the colors you have in your watercolor set, and give them a test swatch. So even if you have just the normal Crayola 24 colors, Crayola 8 color set, you should swatch it. Now I know you've already worked with it in your practices, but by swatching it, it allows you to have just a pure wash of each color. You can then use to look and analyze how they may mix together to create new colors. So you're giving yourself a pure look at the color itself in your set. So I am working with a set of watercolors called Grumbarker, and I have 24 colors in this set. So I'm going to swatch each of these colors so I can have a better understanding of what they look like. Now I had done this earlier, but the sound did not record when I did this. So I'm going to cut now to me just swatching each of my colors, and in the next clip you'll see my piece of white paper with individual sections measured out, the colors name written beside the boxes, and then room for my color swatches. Now that I have test swatched my colors in my watercolor set, it's time for me to painting. So I want to set up my work area. So the first thing I'm going to need is a container in which I can place water. I use a brush bin that I purchased at Michael's, but you can use any bowl that will hold water. What I do suggest though is use something that you wouldn't mind throwing away, because as you can see, even watercolor can stain plastic. You'll of course need paint brushes. So these are some of the paint brushes I like to use when I am working with my watercolor, but I have some others also that are off to the side in case I need them. So I like to have a variety of sizes, round and flat. I of course want my test swatch paper somewhere nearby so I have easy access to it. That way I have it to refer as I work with my colors and start mixing. And I will also want a piece of scrap paper. Again, this can be a piece of watercolor or it could be a piece of sketchbook paper, but something that I could test colors after I mix them or try out a technique I'm not too sure about. Also, I would suggest something to mix colors on. Now, I know if you're using a pan set, a lot of people tend to use the lid for mixing. What I like to use is a styrofoam plate. I find it gives me a nice surface in which I have room to mix colors. And when I'm ready to change out colors, it's easily washed. And I will keep these and wash them so I can use them for paint over and over again. But if it gets stained, it's not going to hurt anything. You will, of course, want your watercolor set nearby. You will want paper towels. Excuse me, I tend to take a little stack of them and keep them by my side because you want to control how much water you are applying to your watercolor. So I like a little pad of those so that they absorb water a little bit faster. You will want your image references. So any image reference that you found for this project, you're going to want to have those nearby. Now you can either print them out like I did, or you can look at those image references on your Chromebooks. And last but not least, you're going to want your project. Now when I set up my work area, I am using my desk here at school. So it's used to getting materials on it. I have this cutting mat that I save for cutting and when I paint. But you may want to cover your work surface at home since you are working on some sort of furniture. You will want to protect it. So you may want to put some newspaper down, or if you have a plastic disposable tablecloth, you may want to put that down. Something that's going to protect your furniture. When I set up, I will place my watercolors, my water, and my paper towels to one side, and I will set those things up first, and then I will get out my project. And the reason is, if I have this laying here and I'm bringing things to my table like water and paint, there's always the chance, you know, I can jostle something like my elbow could bump something, and it could get onto my project. So I do like to bring it to my work surface last, and in the reverse, when I clean up, I like to remove it first so that I don't run the risk of things landing on top of it. So you want to set up your work area, and we're going to start painting our project. I've moved my project off to the side for now, and since I am going to start with that one part of the body, I want to work out the color I need for it. So as I mentioned, I believe my turquoise blue from my set would be a good starting point. So I take my paintbrush and I mix into my paint to pull some of that pigment up into my bristles. And then I transfer it to the area in which I'm going to use for mixing. So notice, to help work the pigment out of my bristles some, I kind of give them a twirl to help try to leave some of that mixture behind. And then of course, before I dip into any other colors, I clean out my paintbrush. Now I've already test swatched this, but I want to do a comparison here. So if I do use this color for the body, what it compares to if I mix it with another color. Now when I mix, I don't start taking colors from my main palette directly into what I just brought over here. I like to keep them separate. Looking at my color, I think I'm going to try a little bit of the Prussian blue. Sorry, the cobalt blue I think might be a better option here. And I'm going to keep it at a distance from my turquoise because I want to be able to control how much color I'm mixing into this. So I'm going to bring some over, clean out my paintbrush, and then I'm going to come in and pick up some of this blue, mix it in with my turquoise, and give it a test here. So I don't know how much that shows up on camera, but it does definitely have a little bit more of a bluish tint to it than what the original turquoise did. Now, I do have to let them dry a little bit, but already the area up here that is starting to dry, I do think that is a better color match than just turquoise straight from my palette. So what I'm going to do then is mix up a large amount of it. And the reason why I do this is because if I need it, then I have it here on my plate and just have to reactivate it to use it. If I don't use it all for this project, well, watercolor, as I said, can dry and not have any adverse effects on it. That meaning I can reactivate it. It's not going to be dry and permanently be wasted. So I'm going to test that again. It's a little bit thicker of a mixture, so I have more pigment and didn't get it as diluted as I did before. And again, I'm going to let that dry and look to see what it looks like compared to my photo reference. So again, the upper part is drier, and I like that color. I think for the brighter parts that can be an okay color. I of course still have to work out what I'm mixing for shadows. And just like in colored pencil, I have choices here. I could try to add black because the printout does look heavily with black, but I know I have options when it comes to creating shadows with color. So I could try just adding more of a darker blue to it to work as a shadow area. I could maybe even add some purple to work as a shadow area. So these are all things I had to process and think about when I'm painting. Again, just like in the color pencil project, we don't want to use colors directly out of the sets. We want to mix colors where we need to mix them. And we want to think about other ways to create value, and especially darker tones, other than just black. Black is not always the best option for our color mixtures. Now, since that is very heavily a color that looks like black mixed into it, if I was completely color matching, I would use black. But I also want a chance to mix watercolors and play around with watercolor and experiment some more with color mixing. So I don't think I'm going to use black for that shadow, and instead I'm going to use one of my other cool tone colors or possibly even a complementary color to add my shadow side. So now that I have a plan of action, I'm going to start painting this area. So I'm going to work with a wet on wet technique, and I'm going to do just one section of my watercolor of the body here instead of doing both. I don't want them to bleed together. There is a very definitive separation between the two. I'm going to work with my watercolor in a thinner state because I can always easily add layers of pigment to my watercolor. And even though we did practice some techniques where you can remove it, it's not always the easiest thing to do. So I am going to work with thin color application. Now, since I am working wet on wet, I do want to kind of monitor how wet my area is for a couple reasons. Mine's still quite liquidy. There's still a lot of water there. So I want to be careful not to add too much there, especially when I go to start mixing in any colors for shading and shadow, because I don't want to flood the area too much. So sometimes you have to kind of monitor it. I like to look at it in the light to see if I can see much of the texture of the paper, and usually if you can see the texture shining of the paper and it doesn't look like a flat sheet of ice, then you have some nice absorption of the pigment and the water into your paper. And see, now even though it is bleeding, which is why I'm using wet on wet, I want that bleeding effect, it is not so saturated with water that it is completely flooding that area. Any place I want it darker, I'm going to start there with the pigment and let it bleed into the areas that I need to be a little bit lighter. And if my paper starts to get too dry, well, then I just wash out my paintbrush. I wipe out a lot of the moisture because I don't want to cause a bloom, and I work that pigment up into the area I want it to be. And notice I'm working over into areas that didn't need softening of the edges, and again, to try to prevent any blooms as much as possible. So I was trying some purple there for my shadow color, and I don't think it was darkening it to what I wanted to. So I've added a little bit of one of my darker blue colors to that purple so that I can start deepening the value. So I'm not thickening up the paint. I'm deepening the color and the value. So there is a difference here, and in watercolor that's very important to note that difference. I don't want to apply a thick amount of paint like I would a acrylic painting or an oil painting. What I want is to deepen up the values, and I do that through layering and color mixing. So do keep that in mind when working with watercolor. Water is the key word there. We need water in our watercolor paintings and in your paint mixtures. Now I also have to be careful as I do work this that I don't end up working so much in an area that I cause my paper to flake or tear. So do keep that in mind also. If you start to notice any flakes of paper starting to lift, then you'll want to just stop, let it dry. You can always come back and add more color to that or lift things out later. So I'm going to let that dry. I'm getting to that point where I'm worried that the paper might start tearing. But that's a good start to adding some value structure to my dragonfly body. Now since that is still damp, I don't want to start this section or this section, as tempting as it may be. I'm going to look for another section that I can work on and work on that section, and then I can always come back to the other one as I mentioned before. So in this section I'm going to try starting out wet on dry so we can see the difference in technique. So notice my color definitely applies a lot more bold because I'm not watering it down by applying it on top of already wet paper. So do keep that in mind, that you can start out with wet on dry if you need your colors to be a little bit more bold, and then where you need the colors to bleed and mix together, you just got to work with it while that first color you lay down is still wet. So again, I'm not working with really thick paint here. What I am working with is a base of pigment that applied a little bit more bold and a little bit darker because it started out on dry paper. So I do like the look of that. And again, I can't work in this section because it's wet. So I'm going to go on to another section of the body and work there. And just like in pencil, you know, we talked about pressure a lot when working with pencil. Pressure with painting is also important too. So if I want a nice thin line in my watercolor, well then I'm not going to press too hard on my bristles so that any paintbrush like this round brush I'm using with a nice point to it can stay as pointed as possible. As I work with it. So notice as I am working, when I want to go into an area near something that's already been painted, I just give it a light little tap to test it to make sure it is dry. If it doesn't feel cool to the touch, then it is dry. Sometimes with watercolor, and depending on the thickness of your paper, you may touch it at first and think it feels dry, but if there's any type of coolness to it, that means it's still damp, and damp paper still runs the risk of things bleeding together. So you want to make sure an area is completely dry before you go in with any of your watercolor to try to prevent it from bleeding into one another. So as my body dries, I went ahead and started the eyes. You'll notice another palette appeared up here. And that is because I do have a second set of these Grumbarkers that is an opaque watercolor set. And it had a magenta color in it that my first set didn't have. So I did test swatch it before I used it. And because what I'm doing is I'm taking the eyes from this photo reference and I'm going to borrow some of the color pigments from it for this dragonfly. So even though I'm using mainly the body colors of the one photo reference, that photo reference, the eyes in the image looks black, and I didn't really want to go with that, at least not yet. After I do this color here, if I do feel then that black might have been a better choice, well then black's easy to paint over top of a color, and I should still be able to get a nice effect with applying it over top of these colors to create a darker eye color. So that is something else I wanted to mention, is even though you may at first want to use black, don't be afraid to try another color. Because black is so dominant, you can easily go back to working with black for your image, no problems. But once you apply black, if then you decide, oh, I wish I would have maybe tried a different color there, it's not going to be quite as easy to lift. In fact, it'll probably stain the paper a lot, and that you probably won't get much lift out of it anyways. And then you're kind of stuck with this other color. So, sorry, with the black. So don't be afraid to experiment, because especially if you're experimenting with colors that are a little bit lighter than the original color you may have been looking at, then that is okay, because then you can always come back to that original color if it's darker and apply it over top. So since I am using this magenta color for the eyes, I'm not using black for the shadow part of the eye. I am playing around with using some purple and blue for that. And I'm just trying to get a shape to the spherical form of the eye that I like. So I'm going to stop there for today. This is the other thing you want to be aware of when starting your watercolor. I know I encourage you to spend at least 42 minutes a day on your projects. Understand that depending on the area you are working with on this project, you may have to work 10, 15, 20 minutes on one section, let it dry, go do some other work, and then come back to it a few minutes later. A large area, like if I was working on the wings, I may have been able to spend 42 minutes alone on one wing and putting the coloration in that. So realize larger areas sometimes you can spend more time on because you have more room to work with. When you're working with smaller areas like this, and especially sections where you want to develop values and highlights and individualize parts in this fine detail, well then it may seem like you're taking smaller chunks of time to work, and that's okay. So just remember to pace yourself as you work at this. Don't be afraid to experiment. Have an extra sheet of paper, to test out colors, color swatch your colors, practice things before you feel comfortable putting it on here. Don't be afraid to take that little bit of extra time to experiment with colors and mixing off of the project, because once it is applied, it is very hard to lift. Sometimes you can make corrections and sometimes you can't. So just realize that. So remember, as you start working on this, your main subject will be full color. No matter what part of it is on the border or inside the rectangle, it will be full color. And the background, the color will only be inside the rectangle. Nothing of the background should be painted with watercolor.